Hi, I'm Dr. Frank Anthony Thomas, and this is another installment of the African American Preaching Legacy series at Princeton Theological Seminary. And we search all over to bring you the brightest and the best preachers to talk about the genius, the depth, the beauty, the power, the imagination, the creativity of African American preaching. And I have one of my great friends here, Buster Soaries, the retired pastor of First Baptist of Lincoln Gardens. He is here with us today, and I just want you to know I'm excited to have you here, and I look forward to all the wisdom you're getting ready to drop.
Well, first of all, Frank, thank you so much for your friendship. Thank you for this platform, for this experience and opportunity, but mostly thank you for describing me as a retired pastor. So often when I go out, people say the former pastor. And that could mean anything. Right. So yes, I did retire and was able to transition into post-pastoral life. It's just wonderful. So thank you.
So we have an audience nationally and internationally that watch these videos. So a lot of us know you based upon your ministry and the great work you've done. Just in case there are a few people in our audience who do not know you, however few that may be. What would you like them to know about Buster Soaries?
Such hyperbole. Listen, I am, as a preacher, a student of the Reverend Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor.
Yes.
Dr. Proctor picked me up after my dad had died. My dad was a preacher, and he died at 47 from medical malpractice. I had worked for Jesse Jackson, a preacher, from the time of my being 23 to the time I was 26. And between my dad's death and meeting Dr. Proctor at Princeton Seminary, I was attempting to develop into a preacher, leader, activist type. But as a preacher, all of the experiences I had, all of the education I had attained, all of the passion for justice and civil rights and human rights came into focus because Sam Proctor was not just a great preacher, but a great teacher. And his homiletical method, his nurturing of just biblical storytelling and transforming that into impactful preaching just descended upon me. And I was fortunate enough to be at Princeton Seminary when Dr. Proctor came to be a visiting professor.
Okay, wow.
I was also fortunate to also sit under Gardner Taylor in my post MDiv studies. And then Sam Proctor invited me to United Theological Seminary to do my D-Min in his group. So I had 5 years of real concentrated Sam Proctor tutelage. And my preaching, my leadership, my pastoral ministry, all three were impacted more significantly by Sam Proctor than any other preacher.
There might be a couple of people who do not know who Sam Proctor is, so why don't you give us a very brief...
Well, Samuel DeWitt Proctor was a theologian, he was a pastor, he was a government official, he was the president of North Carolina A&T University in the 1950s. He was president of Virginia Union University. He had a THD degree from Boston University, went to Crozier Seminary for his MDiv, and was mentored to Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King went to Crozier because of Sam Proctor, and then Dr. King went to Boston because of Sam Proctor. And Dr. Proctor also succeeded Adam Clayton Powell Jr. as the pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. He was the deputy director of the Peace Corps under President Kennedy. And today there's an endowed chair at Rutgers Graduate School of Education, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Chair of Education, because in the 1968 aftermath of the assassination of Dr. King, Rutgers invited Dr. Proctor to come there to teach in any department he chose. And although he had a degree in theology, he chose education because his passion for education landed him there. And Sam Proctor while he pastored in Harlem, he lived in Somerset, New Jersey.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And the church that I pastored was in Somerset, New Jersey. And that's how I got to First Baptist. Sam Proctor, having been president of A&T, had been the president when one of the deacons and one of the trustees at First Baptist were students at A&T in the 50s.
Wow.
And so when the second pastor of First Baptist Church of Lincoln Gardens, where I served, retired, they went to Dr. Proctor to say, we need somebody to replace our second pastor. And Dr. Proctor said, I have a student doing his doctorate under me in Ohio. And so Sam Proctor sent me to First Baptist in Somerset because he wanted his hometown to have one of his students be the pastor. So I always kid with Booth and Beecher Hicks and all those guys that I, in fact, was the closest student of Proctor to Proctor because my church was 1 mile from his house. So it's irrefutable. Right. So I am a Proctorite, no question. And he was like a surrogate dad to me, in addition to being a theological and homiletical influence.
So back me up. So talk to me about your dad being a preacher, your call to seminary, and get me to Proctor.
Okay, sure. I was born in a suburb of Newark, New Jersey, Montclair, a small suburban town, 27,000 people, about 25% African American. And in the southern end of our town, there was an African American enclave of mostly domestic workers who had come from Virginia with their wealthy families who settled in Montclair on the upper part of town. And my grandmother was one of those domestic workers. She was literally brought to New Jersey by, quote unquote, her family in Virginia. And she had 8 children. My mother was the 7th of 8 children. My father was a son of a Jamaican immigrant, and so he lived in Brooklyn. And my mom and dad met at New York University, and my mom liked New Jersey more than New York, and so they moved to New Jersey when I was probably 2 or 3 years old. And I grew up in this town, coming to my teenage years in the 1960s. And prior to the death of Dr. King, my focus as a teenager was baseball, basketball, and girls, you know. But on April 4th, 1968, I stopped by my grandmother's house really to get some sweet potato pie. And I saw my grandmother sitting at her dining room table in tears. My grandmother was the strongest woman that I had ever known, and she was like my best friend. Her husband was an alcoholic. She put him out the bedroom, but she wouldn't put him out of the house. But it didn't work. So she had to raise these 8 children basically alone. She was a domestic worker. 2 of my uncles, her sons, had died. And I watched my grandmother at their funerals, and she never cried. I never saw the pain of life, the frustrations of life, bring tears to my grandmother's eyes. So you can imagine, I'm trying to figure out what could have happened to cause this strong woman to sit in the darkness of her dining room in tears. And I asked her, and she said, they shot Dr. King today. I was still confused. Dr. King had been to our town. He was very close friends with D.C. Rice, who had been Sam Proctor's pastor in Virginia. And I knew the name Martin Luther King. We had watched the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech as a family in little colored resort in upstate New York, King's Lodge. But I didn't understand my grandmother, Pentecostal, not Baptist, what we would call an accommodationist, not an activist. She believed that if we played by the rules, trusted in God, the Lord would make a way somehow, didn't believe in stirring up a fuss, didn't believe in marching and protesting. But Dr. King's life obviously impacted her in ways I would not have imagined. And I said that day, I said 2 things. I said, 1, I've got to find out everything I can about Martin Luther King Jr. And the second thing is, I want my life to be as impactful on someone as Dr. King's life was on my grandmother. So I went to college and I started reading about the civil rights movement, learned all I could. And after college, by the time Jesse Jackson formed Operation Push, I had concluded that Jesse Jackson was the new quote-unquote leader for Black America. And I convinced him that he needed me on his staff, and he hired me at 23 to be the National Field Secretary. I was responsible for organizing different chapters of PUSH around the country. And then when my boss, who had been national coordinator, moved on to the international division of PUSH, Reverend Jackson made me the national coordinator of PUSH. So I ran the organization. During that time, I really came back to church because after my high school years, I really had enough of church. I grew up in a kind of a black offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist movement. There was a big racial split in the 1930s in Harlem between black Seventh-day Adventists and the larger denomination. My grandfather was a part of that split, and so I grew up in that split. And much like Richard Allen and the Methodists of the 18th century, there was a racial split, but the doctrine stayed the same. So I grew up basically Seventh-day Adventist. Church on Saturdays, Sabbath Friday night, no pork, no bacon. It was strict Seventh-day Adventism, but also no social gospel, no activism, no social impact. And so besides just being a bit weary of the rigor of the Seventh-day Adventist legalism and strictness, the missing of the social impact, the kind of ministry that was happening in the South, the kind of proclamation that was happening right there in Harlem by Adam Clayton Powell Jr., I decided that I could be a good person, I could be impactful without the church. But when I joined Reverend Jackson, and we were in church all the time, but it was a different kind of church. Otis Moss Jr., D.E. King, and Billy Kyles, and all of these preachers, H.H. Brookins in the AME church. I then understood what my childhood church was missing and what I was longing for. And so the movement really brought me back to church. But a couple of years in, I realized, and I felt a call from God because I realized that the church had become more utilitarian, that the church was where we went because the people were there. But in terms of my personal conviction, my personal relationship with God, it really did not come together for me until my dad died in 1975. My dad was disciplined. He was basically healthy. He went in for a colonoscopy, which today would have been a tube and a camera. But back in that day, they opened you up and put you under anesthesia. And they gave him too much anesthesia. It induced a heart attack and he died. And that night, I had to reconcile my activism, my philosophy, my theology, and my personal faith. And it was that night that I realized I needed to be spiritually authentic in a way that had social impact, rather than being a social activist in a way that had a spiritual ring to it. And that's when my juxtaposition of faith first and activism second came into being. I didn't know what to do with that. I left PUSH, came to help my mother raise my 8-year-old sister, and I really floundered. I was always busy doing things, leading marches, protesting police brutality, but it was hard for me to really develop a coherent theology, homiletic preaching style. When my dad died, he was pastor, and what's interesting is that my call to ministry was not a call to preach. In fact, I told my dad, I said, Dad, I really feel called to be a minister, but I don't want to wear robes. I don't want to do communion. I don't want to do baptisms. I want to be an activist with the church as my base. So I wanted the prophetic without the priestly. And 2 months in, after my dad had agreed, my dad said, you know what, there's a role for that. Not every pastor, not every preacher, not every minister has the same calling. And while some ministries are music, some ministries are education, a community social ministry is a valid path to take. And so 2 months after he licensed me to ministry, didn't license me to preach. Listen, Frank, I was so non-priestly that when I did speak in church, he'd have to come behind me and add some scriptures. He dressed it up and called it team preaching. But the fact is, I'd get up and talk about housing and politics and voter registration, and he'd come in and say, oh, by the way, Jesus did say such and such. But 2 months of that, he died. And when he died, the little church that he had said to me, listen, we need you to fill in for your dad while we look for someone. And I filled in, and after 10 years, when I realized they weren't looking, I said, first of all, I'm not ready for this. I hadn't been to seminary yet, and I was preaching my dad's old sermons. And secondly, I really, by that time, because of my involvement with Push and my relationships with preachers around the country, I basically had become Baptist in a Seventh-day environment, and I just felt convicted. It was not fair for me to try to turn them into something different, and so we parted ways, and I went to Princeton, met Dr. Proctor, and the rest is history. So I kind of came in to the pastoral ministry through the side door because I was called to be a minister, didn't feel called to be a pastor, and again, it all came together through circumstances and through the influence of Sam Proctor.
That is an amazing summary, and that really keys me into now the homiletic method. So, where'd you go to seminary? And then drop me into the Hegelian. I know where you're going.
So I went back to Fordham because my major at Rutgers was community development.
Okay.
And now that I'm back in church, I'm called to preach. I'm trying to reconcile my spiritual and my social perspectives. I decided that I should go and really do some biblical studies. So I got 2 undergraduate majors. The first was at Rutgers in community development, and the second was at Fordham University in their religious studies department, which was a life-changing experience. I had professors from Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. I took classical Greek there for 2 years. The Fordham experience was so intense that the same books that I used at Fordham, they used at Princeton in my master's program. And so I went to Princeton very prepared, and when I got there, I did not do well in preaching at all. The preaching professors just hated my preaching. They didn't believe in starting with a biblical text, and they wanted more obscure narrative styles. I just didn't do well in preaching at Princeton. Until 2 things happened. One, I had a professor named Randy Nichols. Randy Nichols wrote a book called The Restoring Word. He had a doctorate in theology, and he was also a psychiatrist. And he approached the preaching moment from the perspective of pastoral care. Yeah. It's a life-changing book for me. Yeah. Really life-changing. And the first sermon that I prepared and delivered in class, here's what he wrote. He said, "Please invite me when you preach this in a black church." And so he affirmed my preaching in ways that no other professor at Princeton had affirmed, none of whom, by the way, had any exposure or experience with the black church. None, except Randy. Yeah. And then year 2 came Sam Proctor. Right. And Sam Proctor came with the Hegelian dialectic, and it was transformative.
Break it down quickly.
Sam Proctor came and said, listen, here are the elements of a sermon. Number 1, you need to be able to describe your entire sermon in 25 words or less. That's your proposition. And then he said, when you look at life, preaching, look at any subject, there are always 2 sides to the subject. There's the reality and the ideal. There's the thesis and the antithesis. And the 2 of those combined, don't be legalistic and make one precede the other, but those elements have to be in your introduction. Right. And then the third is your relevant question. I am such a Proctorite that my last sermon I preached for a pastor's anniversary was called The Relevant Question. and that was critical because as young preachers, the hardest thing to do is to really discipline yourself to have sermonic content that answers one question. And so Proctor taught us, it was a relief for me, because you get up there and there are all kinds of thoughts in your mind. Every scripture can be described 5 or 6 different ways. So listen, don't worry about it. You know, just land on one question. That's your relevant question. And then the body of your sermon answers that question. And every sermon I've preached, every graduation speech I've given, every banquet that I address, every article I've written, every book I've written has followed Proctor's Hegelian dialectic. Yes, sir.
Well, you know, there's quite a few of you all that I could name.
Oh yes, we are Proctorites.
Yeah, I mean, you know, y'all have an enclave. I mean, it's a tribe. You know, Jeremiah Wright comes right off the bat.
It's
you know,
a tribe.
Charles Booth. It's a whole tribe, and that's just that generation. They don't count the generation.
That's right.
The generation underneath.
That's right. He wrote it, thank God, in his book, The Certain Sound of the Trumpet, and it's putting the sermon together. That's the chapter. And I've given dozens of preachers that book and marked that chapter. Read this. Yeah, but it has been structure that has flexibility, but it also has definition, and it has delivered me time after time after time after time after time. And I can't thank God enough for the instruction of Sam Proctor.
So give me your sense of preaching today. What do you think is going on in particularly African-American preaching today?
Well, I think there's a crisis in the African-American pulpit. I think there's a crisis in understanding. That's why I love what you do so well. I think a lot of the external analysis of the black church and black preaching, normally uninformed, but the external, that heard the poetry and the rhyme and the antics, a lot of that was concluded. A lot of that analysis concluded that black preaching is only entertainment, and that black preaching has no substance, that black preaching is almost anti-intellectual. And that came from all sectors of the church. I think that has crept into a lot of black pulpits. A lot of black pulpits have concluded that the legacy of African-American proclamation is shallow and is irrelevant and, frankly, not good for business. And so academic training has not only become optional, but academic training has been the victim of thoughtless attack to the point where the seminary's nickname is the cemetery, right? So there's been a lack of understanding, lack of appreciation. I think there's been a lack of appreciation for the quote unquote unlettered black preachers of the past who had hermeneutical genius, had spiritual insights on biblical interpretation and biblical narrative that literally saved our people. Saved our people. If you go to the Museum of the Bible right now in Washington, D.C., they have an old copy of one of the slave Bibles. It's right there. And to think that people who were enslaved were able to take this ancient text in spite of all of the corruption that was attached to it and use it as a tool of liberation. I mean, that is a miracle. It's the miracle of Christian history, in my view. I think the existence of the black church is the most unique schism. You know, I asked ChatGPT a few weeks ago to give me a list of the major schisms in Christianity. And of course, you know, they went to the Greek Orthodox versus the Roman Catholic. They went to German with Luther. They never mentioned Richard Allen in the black church. Never. Yeah. Even though the black church is the only schism that occurred within Christianity in 2,000 years that was based on justice. It wasn't based on doctrine, really. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones sang from the same hymn books, read the same scriptures, prayed from the same prayer book. But it was the only one. We weren't arguing over whether Jesus was, whether Mary was the mother of God or mother of Jesus. We weren't arguing over icons. We weren't arguing over, some creed. It was justice. And I think the black pulpit today, because of its disdain in many instances of education, we just don't know. I heard a woman recently, very proudly and boldly say, there is no black church. There's no such thing as a black church. We're all, Jesus. Well, there is a black church. And it's not black because we are black, and it's not black because it's for black people. It's black because something happened in the 18th century inside Christianity that was as meaningful and significant as what happened in the 16th century in Germany. So I think preaching has been a casualty in many ways of that ignorance, and it has manifested itself in people proudly boasting that they don't believe in preaching, they only believe in teaching, as if they're mutually exclusive. And so my fear is that the secular understanding of success has driven a model that has attracted people to something other than preaching. I explained to our people that both are important. Preaching is proclamation. Teaching is explanation. And all proclamation includes explanation. And in most instances, explanation can lead to proclamation. But the two should not be competitors. The two are companions in ministry. So that's why I love what you do. Again, I love what you do. I love the people who are committed to the art, the craft, and the ministry of preaching. Preaching is a ministry. And it's needed. The psalmist asked the question, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Black people in America are in a strange land. No other people went through what we went through and then hung around to matriculate and function as if it never happened. No other people did that. Right. The Bible says in Exodus, the children of Israel were in slavery for 400 years and they left the country. They didn't hang around. They left the country. We stayed right here to build schools and to become artists and to lead institutions and start businesses. It's unprecedented and unparalleled in human history. And preaching has been central to the manner in which we were able to make these various transitions and survive these various vicissitudes. Preaching, more than anything else. Preaching has been foundational, and I'm praying that your legacy, in large measure, will be the proliferation of that understanding and the deepening of appreciation for that reality.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I want you to tell me a time when you've been preaching many years now. What was the hardest moment that you had to walk into and preach? What was?
Yeah, the hardest moment that I had to walk into and preach was the funeral for a husband, wife, and daughter. The husband came home and decided to shoot his wife, who was a member of our choir, shoot his daughter, who was a star basketball player at her high school, and then shoot himself. And they made the decision to have a triple funeral. So you can imagine the husband's family sitting over here, angry because their assumption is that the wife drove their relative crazy. Otherwise, he'd never done that. If he had never married that woman, none of this would be. Because the wife's family is over here, mad at the husband because he killed their relative. The balcony of the church is full of kids who are the friends of the daughter. And these children think both parents are crazy and they're just mad. Now, it would have been somewhat less challenging if I had 3 different funerals, but all 3 caskets were there at the same time. Wow. And I had to preach to all 3 audiences at the same time and attempt to elevate them above their reality and experience the grace of God simultaneously. That was the most difficult moment of my preaching career.
So what did you preach?
Well, from a factual standpoint, I had to address the reality that no one really knows what happened. Mm-hmm. And let's not succumb to the rumors and the assumptions. None of us were there. And so none of us knows what happened. But this man who committed this heinous act was a man who had some redemptive qualities and features, and I had to remind people what they were. Yeah. This woman who sang in our choir and was a good mother had some redemptive qualities, and we celebrate that because the funeral was a celebration. This young woman whose life was cut too short. So we have 2 realities. We have the pain of the tragedy, but we have the opportunity to celebrate what there is to celebrate. And I forget what text I used. The complication was exacerbated by this. The older sister who escaped the tragedy was not in the house because she was visiting her boyfriend while her husband was in active duty. Okay. The conversation with him was more difficult than the eulogy.
That's right, I got it.
Because on the one hand, we're happy that she's alive, but on the other hand, he wants to know, well, where were you at 2 o'clock in the morning? So that was difficult, and it speaks to the need to be very prayerful as a pastor and as a preacher, and to walk with people in their pain in a manner that exudes grace and mercy and not condemnation and certainty. It's all right to question God. If we understood all of why God allows things to happen, we would be God. Right. That was the most difficult.
Let's go to the other side. Give me a time when you just knew God used you. It was beyond what you could even have dreamed to happen or occur, and just the Spirit moved. Give me a time.
Yeah, I went to Patterson East Side High School as a young preacher. I was there because the school board had asked me what they could possibly do to get this school under control. It was the school that made Joe Clark famous, the principal with the baseball bat. Mm-hmm. And it was just prior to his being named principal. I went there for Dr. King's birthday to speak, and it took 20 minutes for the school to calm the kids down. They were fighting in the auditorium, and it was an unruly place. Kids were in the bathroom smoking weed and blowing the smoke in the principal's face. So we got the churches together in town, and we organized a citywide youth crusade. And we had nightly services, citywide youth choir, counselors, kind of an urban youth Billy Graham type strategy. Right. And that week, 500 kids came to Christ in that school. They set up a classroom for counseling, and there are kids today. A young man joined First Baptist a couple of years ago who was a student at that school. This is 1985, right? And he got up at First Baptist 2 or 3 years ago. And when he joined, took the mic, and he said, I was one of those kids at Patterson East Side High School when this man came to preach, and he gave the congregation the names of every sermon I preached every night in that week. It was the most impactful for me to see these kids in a tough school embrace the message of Jesus in public.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's go to DFree.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give you the mic. I'm going to give you the floor. Anything you want to tell us how it started. Give me DFree.
Well, I told you about my activism. I told you about Jesse Jackson and all of that, speaking truth to power as a young man. What I didn't tell you is that during those same formative years, I was using credit cards as though they were income. I was driving Lincolns and Cadillacs, whose monthly expense was half my salary. I had no savings. I had no insurance. I had no investing. When my dad died at 47, my mother was at 44. And if my dad had not had life insurance and mortgage insurance, my mother would have been homeless, because I was in the newspapers, I was on TV, I'm marching for freedom, and I couldn't have given her $10. It was all dressed up on the outside, right? When I met my wife, which was about 8 years before we got married, she thought I was rich. I mean, I'm driving a Cadillac and wearing nice clothes. And then when I was filling in for my pastor, after my dad died, filling in at the church until they found somebody, I'm preaching, tithing, we're Seventh-day Adventists. I couldn't tithe at all. I'm preaching, tithing, couldn't practice tithing because all of my money was leaving before I made it. So that was my lifestyle. And I lived that way for 13 years. My father's mother was a seamstress. That was her skill. She had 6 children. Her husband had a stroke after the 6th child and couldn't work. So my grandfather couldn't work. My grandmother sewed other people's clothes. When she died, she owned 3 houses, paid for. Paid for. No education. Right. No civil rights, right? Right. And she left one of those houses to me. And I stood at her grave in December, I'll never forget it. And I said, shame on me. If I died right now, all I'd have to leave anybody's credit card bills. And this black woman, basically single parent, took care of her husband, owned 3, and not just 3 houses. The house she lived in was a 5-story brownstone in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, where all the rich preachers live. Sandy Ray, Gardner Taylor, she lived in their neighborhood. When she died, she left that house to her daughter. My aunt, when my aunt died, she left it to my cousin. My cousin, single teacher, didn't need all that house. She sold it. She's a millionaire. So my grandmother made my cousin a millionaire. Second house, 20-acre estate in upstate New York. She bought an old 23-bedroom used old hotel, and she bought it so the kids in the church would have a place to go in the summertime. She left that house to my uncle. My uncle sold off the acreage she bought it for $12,000. He sold it for $40,000 an acre. He became a millionaire. The last house was a four-family house in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, which today probably cost $3 million. She left that to me and my uncle. We sold it. I took the proceeds from that sale to put as a down payment on my first house when I got married. And I said at her grave, I've got to change. And so I sold my luxury car. I moved out of my bachelor apartment. I got rid of all the furniture I had charged, on credit, got rid of all of that, moved to my mother's house as a preacher activist, slept in a sleeping bag on her floor for 6 months. And I took all the rent money, all the car payment money, student loan money, all the money I owed to get out of debt. So fast forward now. 2005, we're in the new sanctuary. We've built a 2,000-seat sanctuary. We've got 13 classrooms, and the church is doing well, but things are tight. We had construction problems. Then we had all of these new people joining the church and not giving anything. The trustees want me to be a fundraiser. That's not what I do. I'm an activist preacher, and I'm thinking it's time to leave until I look in the parking lot and I see all these new cars. I see Cadillacs, Lincolns, that one guy has a Maserati. And it really occurred to me that I'd put so much emphasis on community, on justice, on salvation, that I had not put sufficient emphasis on helping people overcome the lifestyle that I had lived. I knew what it looked like. We had a big offering for Katrina, 2005. We had a big offering for Katrina, And a young, well-dressed lawyer said to me, I wish I had something to give. And I said, give me that designer belt. I'll sell it on eBay. So I decided that I would teach them my process. This is what happened to me. I stopped using debt as though it was income. I stopped being so sloppy that I was paying late fees because my bills were always paid late. And I started living within my means. I started living on a budget, having a spending plan. And then what I started was saving. I put deposits in my own account. I started earning dividends from investments, and I had real estate now. My name was on a deed. So it was the bad deeds and the good deeds. And the focus was on freedom. So it's freedom from, freedom to. And that's where the brand came from. And we found after 1 year of teaching everybody in our church biblical principles for giving, the mindset for financial wellness, the need to not equate who you are with what you own, the offerings went up in the church by $1 million in 1 year. 1 year. No fundraising, no $500 lines, no turning God into Santa Claus, just teaching people common sense and, by the way, culturally relevant. Black America survived in large measure because of the way we handled our money. And CNN came along 5 years later, did a documentary, 90-minute documentary called Almighty Debt. They saw us helping people rise above using credit to support lifestyles they couldn't afford. And it just blew up. I wrote a book and a workbook in churches all over America, and now in Liberia, Ghana, South Africa, are using our curriculum to teach biblically based, culturally relevant financial principles that liberate people. And it starts with getting started, but it ends with giving back. Because giving, investing in philanthropic and social impact is a part of financial freedom. Who wants to create a whole community of millionaires that just brag about how rich they are? But the whole purpose for having resources is to support Black institutions, to support legacy funds, to support people that need the kind of bridge that I once needed. So it's been so liberating for me personally, and to see people whose credit scores go up, who go from renting to owning, who go from being stressed over finances to living stress-free. It's just every testimony I get is fuel to keep me going.
So if anybody wants to contact you or is interested in getting more information about DFree, give us a...
Oh, sure. DFree.com is the website, and the gateway into, we have a free online academy where people can take the 12-step course. They can get access to our books. But the most exciting thing about DFree is the testimonies. You can click a link, go to our YouTube page, and hear people give testimonies of how this program, this ministry has helped them. I was lecturing at another seminary a couple of weeks ago, and a woman came up to me and she said, I've always told God if I ever bump into Dr. Soaries, I'm going to let him know I survived the pandemic financially because of that teaching. So it's exhilarating, and I'm grateful to many of our mutual friends who have made this a part of their Christian education curriculum in their churches.
So let's talk about legacy for a moment. And so how do you see your legacy, or what will, you made a prescription about my legacy, so tell me about what do you want the legacy of Buster Soaries to be?
Well, I described myself outside of the church, but inclusive of the church, as someone who wanted to be remembered by solving problems, solutions. And I say that really in contrast to my first life, before I kind of grew up and came to my senses, was to be an activist. And unfortunately, activism too often focuses on identifying, exposing problems. Mm-hmm. And there's a valid role for that. As an activist, my job was to make sure slum landlords were exposed. My job was to make sure abusive police practices were exposed. My job was to make sure voter suppression was exposed. I mean, there's a valid role for that. I just didn't want to spend the rest of my life exposing problems. I wanted to be remembered for having solved some problems. And my D-Men project had to do with using the revival event in churches to mobilize people in the church to respond to social pathology and needs in the community. So revivals for me were never just religious entertainment, but revivals were, as it were, the mass meetings of the civil rights movement, where yes, it's high pitch, it's good music, it's prayer and praise, but with the purpose of going out from the church to do something. So if you look at the work I've done, we completely transformed the lives of 1,400 children who were in foster care. We completely brought revitalization to a neighborhood that was the poorest neighborhood in the region without any gentrification and no dislocation. 2,000 new units of affordable housing, 80,000 square foot primary health care center. We brought a branch of the community college into the community. Senior housing for people who have modest means. So when you look at the work at First Baptist, we didn't just build a new worship center. We built a new community. Home ownership, people who were paying $1,800 a month for rent bought brand new homes for $800, mortgage, principal, and interest. So I want to be remembered as someone who solved problems, inclusive of solving the problem of how to preserve the integrity of a traditional black church, but grow it into being relevant for a contemporary community. Because we lived through the season of black churches having to convince black people that they should come to church. You know, when I was a kid, black people just went to church. It was the only place we had to go. It was the only place that sponsored bus rides. It was the basketball leagues. I mean, the black churches where we ate chicken and traveled on trips. But in the post-civil rights era, the black church needed more than racism. You know, the black church was, you know, what the scholars call our surrogate world. Well, when we were integrated into the larger world, we didn't need as much surrogacy as we did in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so what I was able to do, by the grace of God, with the help of some very passionate people, is to take a very traditional, tell you how traditional the church was. My first contract at First Baptist in 1990 said, the pastor must attend all Sunday afternoon programs. We were the Sunday afternoon church. We had 65 auxiliaries. There were 52 weeks in a year, and every one of them had an annual day. So the pastor's biggest job there was to figure out which auxiliary had to skip 1 year. You know, we had 9 choirs. Right. And First Baptist had one of those Sunday afternoon cultures where the church was packed. Right. And they wanted the pastor to be there. That was the priority. How many churches do you know today have Sunday afternoon programs, every usher's anniversary, you know, the flower club? I mean, that tradition has gone away. And we had to make sure that when that tradition, because it was dying then, but that tradition was dying, that we replaced it with something that was substantive and would retain the commitment and the enthusiasm of those people. And today the church is thriving, the church is prospering. It's not the old church, but we positioned it for the future. We started streaming in 2009. We started having online Bible study, online worship, online seminars, 11 years before the pandemic. So we were we solved the problem before the problem emerged. And that's what I'd like my legacy to be, whether it's in building strong churches, whether it's leadership training, in succession. You know, we've talked about this. I gave 5 years notice for my retirement. But when I gave the notice, I also gave notice to the heads of all of our ministries, you too shall retire. Right. that we had a church leadership-wide succession plan for trustees, deacons, the head of the ushers, everybody. Let us find our successors together and let's prepare them for the future of our church. except the women's auxiliary. They were exempt for reasons that we won't get into today. But succession planning and how to do it, and then helping pastors understand what their options are after they leave the pulpit. You were an example. You left the pulpit. People thought you lost your mind. They had all that big church down there in Memphis. You would say, well, what happened? And they assume it's scandal or sickness, because that's generally what happens when people leave, quote unquote, before their time. So I want to be remembered as someone who not only understood problems and identified problems, but worked on solutions that are replicable and scalable, and not dependent on anyone having to be me to get it done.
I want you to, thank you for all of this. I want to conclude this with giving you the floor to speak to the nation, or speak to the Black church, or given the reality of the enshrinement of white supremacy and the resulting patriarchy, homophobia, militarism, gun culture, all these things. I want to give you a moment, based on all your experience in your life, you have a word to speak to everybody, the Black church. It's just the wealth of all that you have. I'm gonna turn the mic to you, and so what would you say?
I think the depth of challenge in this society is conspicuously misunderstood. The psychological, emotional, and therefore economic and educational impact of enslavement, and then Jim Crow for over 350 years. I don't think we fully understand, we meaning the nation, the lingering effects and the therefores that need to be taken seriously. Certainly white America has not been taught. They have no clue. And in many instances, Black America, Black youth today grew up in a world that, at least from all appearances, was available to them. None of us grew up in a world where we thought we could go anywhere. None of us. Every one of us knows some section of town that we just shouldn't go to, without signs, without any legal prohibition. We just knew that's not for us. And I think, therefore, we have to rethink education. We have to rethink what it would take to help people appreciate. And I'm not talking about building resentment or hatred at this point. I'm just talking about understanding. I don't think people understood the dehumanization and effects of that on Black America. I don't think, well, and I think the recent election kind of reminded us of how little white America has been taught about itself, about the pain of being an oppressor. Dr. King always talked about how racism affects the racist as much as it does the victim. I was talking to some folks just not long ago about Billy Graham. On the one hand, I think to myself, there is no moral or religious leader of the stature today that Billy Graham had. But suppose Billy Graham had weighed in more on justice. Suppose Billy Graham had really brought to the white church the theological nature of racism. Because it would take somebody like Billy Graham. Suppose Billy Graham had done more than have Dr. King come and sit on stage at one of his rallies. So I think, in summary, what I regret today is that we don't have moral leadership. In fact, just the whole concept of morality was hijacked by a political movement. But to the extent that we want to be a great nation, it would seem that we need a stronger consensus around right and wrong, good and bad. But self-interest has permeated our thought process to the point where if it's good for me, it's good, and if it's bad for me, it's bad, and there's no objective consensus around good and bad. And that's what this country lacks. And unfortunately, I think we look to the political sector for things that neither politics nor government are equipped to do or capable of doing. So it brings me back to the church. It's why I believe so strongly in the church. And I think church leadership has got to resist the temptation of folding into the political winds and be the head and not the tail. That's my deep prayer and concern.
Man, I appreciate so much this time with you. I want y'all to know these are the kinds of conversations we have offline.
Right, on the phone, in private.
Yeah, right. This, just tremendous wisdom and depth. And thank you so much. We're going to spread this far and wide. And may God bless you and your ministry, DFree, all that you have just tremendously offered, not only to the Black church, but to the nation.
Thank you.
What you have stood for, the integrity and your family. And so I just bless you and thank you for doing this. And somebody got to figure out a way to get a round 2 out of you. So I'll work on that. But thank you for being with us.
No, I'm honored. I'm honored, Frank. Man. You know that. Honored. God bless you. Thanks for what you do.
Thank you, sir.